Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days, just probably not exactly how you would expect from our title. My name is Clayton Becker.
And I am Megan Cox.
And today we've brought you a very, very special guest in honor of Mother's Day. I thought, what better gift to get your mother than bringing her onto your podcast to extract some free labor out of her. We have my literal, actual mom on the podcast today. Ma, why don't you tell everyone just a little bit about yourself before we get into, what we're going to talk about today?
Sure. So I'm Karen Safio. I'm Clayton Becker's mom. You're not like anonymous on this or anything.
No. Though people keep forgetting who I am. It's very weird.
And yes, so I'm a Presbyterian pastor, have been for 35 years, and recently switched from parish ministry to being something called an executive presbyter, which is not an equivalent of a bishop, but like a counterpart to that, in that we oversee the ministry of the Presbyterian Church in a particular area, but Presbyterians are far too democratic to have bishops or invest any one individual with very much power. So I get to, sit in a lot of meetings rather than say, this is how it's going to be.
Yes, we were discussing yesterday as it broke that they had chosen a new pope. We were like, oh, wow, can't believe they didn't choose mom. But, they chose someone who's from just down the road from where she was born. So,
yeah, actually, they couldn't have picked me, but Dad had a shot at it because
it's true. Dad did have a shot at it.
Male, yes.
Yes. We won't belabor the point too much, but yes, it was very funny family group chat conversation yesterday. But so we've brought Mom here to talk about Mother's Day, and specifically we've brought her here to talk about rejecting the Hallmark version of Mother's Day, and embracing, I think the phrase that she said specifically when she suggested the topic was the, dare I say, the more radical, dare I say, woke origins of the holiday. So with that in mind, what are the woke origins of Mother's Day here?
Well, woke might be taking it too far, but there are actually kind of two streams, maybe three, that come together for Mother's Day. I mean, if you go all the way back, there are people that will point you to the pre-Christian religions where there were a lot of fertility goddesses that were worshipped, and special days dedicated to festivals dedicated to those goddesses. Some folks will say, well, that's the real roots of Mother's Day. And there might be something to that. Then also in the medieval church, the fourth Sunday of Lent, going back in, like I said, the Middle Ages, there was something called Mothering Sunday. But it wasn't sort of mothers as in your actual mother. It was the day you were supposed to go to your mother church, the church where you'd been baptized.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that was a thing. And it was for everybody, it was particularly for clergy to go back to, because presumably they were no longer serving in the church where they'd been baptized. They would go back to the church where they'd been baptized. And then a little later, you get into like the 16, 17, 1800s. It was a day where people would, where nobles would, or the affluent would give their servants the Sunday off to go home and visit their mother church and, by extension, their own mothers. And then that kind of was falling out of, it was as fewer and fewer people had servants, it was kind of falling out of practice. But then the American origins of Mother's Day came from someone named Anna Jarvis, who wanted to honor her mother, Anne Jarvis, who had been a nurse during the Civil War and had nursed soldiers on both sides and very much kind of a peace activist. And her mother had also been friends with Julia Ward Howe, who you may or may not know wrote the word to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And Julia Ward Howe was a staunch abolitionist and a suffragette and a peace advocate. And in 1870, she wrote the Mother's Day Proclamation. Could I read a little bit of it?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Okay. This is how it starts. It says, "Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether our baptism be that of water or tears. Say firmly, we will not have the great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses or applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. And it goes on in that vein for several more paragraphs. So
seems pretty woke to me. I'm not gonna lie.
it kind of is. Yeah, I mean, it kind of is. It goes on in that vein. So anyway, so Anna Jarvis and Julia Ward Howe were friends, and then later her daughter wanted to have Mother's Day, and so she started it in her church, and it was a day sort of in the spirit of this original Mother's Day proclamation of women coming together to work for peace, to end suffering, and that was kind of the spirit of it, of women coming together, mothers coming together for the good of all children everywhere, and to end war and suffering. And so she did this, and she was really eager to have it be a national holiday, but the federal government was not interested at that time.
Federal government intransigence.
So she couldn't get anybody at that level to be interested in making it a national holiday at that moment. So she went to state governments, and she was an organizer. She got lots of states to agree that to have a Mother's Day. And so I think it was finally Woodrow Wilson was finally convinced to go ahead and make it a national declaration that the second Sunday of May would be Mother's Day. And so then after that, it didn't take very long till it became very commercialized, and people started selling Mother's Day cards, and it became more of a sentimental celebration of mothers and traditional motherhood, which made Ann Jarvis very angry. In fact, she was then starting to campaign against Mother's Day because it had been co-opted by corporate interests and, the more traditionalists.
Almost immediately watered down.
Yeah, like within a decade. Yeah, so she was not happy.
Okay. That's what I was going to ask. I was like, what kind of short timeline are we talking about here? But
pretty short.
Gotcha.
Pretty short.
Okay.
Very, very.
But as Mother's Day was becoming more of a thing in the United States, there was a woman, and now I'm not going to remember her name, in England, who decided, we should revive Mothering Sunday as a thing. And she also was she said it should be about our mother, the church. This was in the Church of England. Our mother, the church, our actual mothers, and the mother of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and Mother Earth, our Mother Nature. So she kind of had those four things she wanted it to focus on. But it kind of devolved also into sort of a very sentimental celebration of traditional motherhood, and along the lines of American Mother's Day. So, and I would say that as a pastor serving in different churches, there were contrary pressures. There were people that wanted to really hit Mother's Day hard on Mother's Day and kind of make the whole service about that, and give out flowers and honor mothers. And then there would be others who would say, I never come to church on Mother's Day because I'm a mother who's had a child who died. I've struggled with infertility and I just can't stand it. My mother was abusive. I don't want to be around while you're celebrating mothers. So it was sort of this, push me, pull you. And so I'm, as a executive presbyter, I guess I'm a guest preacher a lot. So I'm preaching this Sunday. So I had to, email the pastor of the church and ask him, so how do you play Mother's Day at your place? Do I need to hit it hard, or are we backing off? He said, well, we'll mention it in the prayer, but we don't.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do a lot else.
So when we talk about this devolution, this quick devolution from this sort of peace activist, the environmentalism, all of that, into this commercialized holiday where it's, celebrating the traditional family values and all of that, is that a a directed effort from corporations to commercialize things, or does it just happen because maybe people aren't ready for it yet?
I think it's kind of a combination of things. I think, you know, the greeting card industry was really picking up steam right around then.
It
So
was a Victorian innovation.
this was another opportunity to sell greeting cards. Florists kind of got on the bandwagon. Apparently, Anne Jarvis's mother's favorite flower was the carnation. So at the very first Mother's Day service that she gave out carnations, and then that started to be a thing. And when I was a kid, I remember there was like this very complicated code, and I'm not even going to remember what it was. Like that we did get, mom you got carnations when you came to church at Mother's Day, and you got like one color if you were a mother, one color if like you were a grandmother, and a different color if your mother had died. Or anyway, it was just like this very complicated code. Like, yes, thing.
You're creating all of this kind of pageantry that's really missing the point.
Yes.
Because it seems to me, when we talk about Anne Jarvis and her initial work organizing in her community in West Virginia, it was about pacifism. It was about kind of truth and reconciliation after the Civil War, but also public health and hygiene seemed like that was a huge component of what she did. And in the 1800s, where you don't have public health measures, you don't have infrastructure, like you don't have clean water. Mothers are the ones responsible for hygiene. Mothers are the ones responsible for food safety. Mothers are the ones responsible for providing medical care to their rafts of children, many of whom will die. And if you're interested in taking kind of the burdens off of mothers, it would seem that focusing on the policy of improving hygiene, improving public health, improving education, et cetera, or sharing skills with people in your community to do those things, those would be the better ways to actually improve the lives of mothers. And greeting cards are so much easier.
Right, exactly. But I think also, if you think of like what was happening politically and in the church world of the early 1900s, that's when sort of fundamentalism really takes off. So this sort of churchy Mother's Day thing that you could then use to glorify traditional motherhood, and their interpretation of what biblical motherhood looked like. That was just like this great opportunity to co-opt it for that, as opposed to what you're talking about and what Anne Jarvis was talking about.
Yeah. What I'm talking about is kind of socialism.
Well, I think it's important to note that, the early 20th century is sort of like the heyday for any sort of socialist movement in the United States. Also, like the heyday of the temperance movement, the suffrage movement, and all of these things, especially like the temperance movement and the suffrage movement, are fundamentally led by women, right?
Yes, women are at the forefront of making our lives less bad.
People laugh at the temperance movement, and there is some stuff to be laughed at, but the root of that was like people were suffering because the guys were drunk all the time, right? Abusive, drunk guys don't go to work, and so families were suffering, and so really, it was less about liquor is in itself evil, and more like we need to help families thrive. We need children and women not to suffer, and so we need the guys not to be drunk.
And I think
and we mock prohibition, but it really reset our national relationship with alcohol, and it was probably useful in that way.
Yeah, because you look at the statistics from this time, like from the pre-prohibition era, and the average American during that time was drinking like 3 to 4 times the amount of alcohol that they are today, right? Like the average person who drinks, right? Because nowadays, like 30-40% of people are teetotal, right? That was just a completely different world 150 years ago. And yes, prohibition did not work particularly well. There are problems that it engendered organized crime and things like that. But if you look at, again, the statistics here, like the amount of alcohol that people drink has gone significantly down, right? As the cultural elements of the movement, even if not the legal elements of the movement, sort of continued. And I don't think that it's really possible to separate the fact that all of these movements are happening at the same time. The progressive movement, the socialist movement, the temperance movement, the suffrage movement, they're all part of this same sort of of backlash to the Gilded Age, frankly, the late 19th century, rampant inequality, industrialization. But all of these things, as we've said, are hard to do, right? They're hard to achieve. It's hard to convince people that they should drink less. It's hard to implement, more robust public health policies. It's hard to do things, right? And so, like you said there, Mom, and Megan, like you said, it's easier to co-opt it using religion and greeting cards in a way that's symbolic and sort of satiates the feeling that people have that they want something like this, without actually having to go to the trouble of doing the difficult things that the powers that be don't actually want to happen in the first place, because there are powerful interests aligned against them.
Yeah, if your incentive is to tell women that they shouldn't want to vote, they shouldn't want to preach on their own behalf, they should be content to listen to men in politics and men at the pulpit, then it makes perfect sense to, it's like the pizza party rather than a raise in your workplace.
Yes,
you get
exactly.
a holiday about how important your contributions are to society rather than any sort of actual empowerment.
And I think we can sort of safely say that even if it became commercialized very quickly, within Anne Jarvis's lifetime, and I think, when did she die? Late 1940s?
48.
1948?
I did check. Yeah.
The commercialization of everything has increased since then, but of Mother's Day specifically, to the point where before this topic was brought up as a potential thing we could do, I didn't realize that there were non-commercial origins to the holiday, right? Like, as someone born at the very tail end of the 20th century, I have never experienced a Mother's Day that was like, beyond sort of the like, oh, well, let's, recognize that mothers are important and they do important things. And then, like, given that I grew up in a liberal household, was tinged with the inflected with women's rights rhetoric and all of that. But even then, like, that's just in the house.
I never really do Mother's Day because it's on a Sunday and I was working.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, that is rough for you. Not really a breakfast in bed kind of setup.
Not so much. Yeah.
Yes, we went to church, and then we went out for breakfast or brunch or lunch or whatever. And I mean, a solid half of the Mother's Days growing up, you had like a session meeting after church, practically. Yeah,
like didn't even bother much. So yeah.
But to the point, right? Like, the origins of Mother's Day have become even further lost at this point. And the movements that accompanied the creation of Mother's Day, I would say, have also sort of been lost a little bit, right? Like, there isn't really, especially sort of the like progressive and socialist movements in the United States, they're not as strong as they used to be, right? Like, you have people on the left in the United States, obviously, who talk about building the movement, who speak about things like late stage capitalism and all of that. But from my vantage point, at least, like, the like broad leftist movement in the United States has never been further from achieving its goals. And again, I don't know that that's fully separable from the fact that we've lost sight of what a number of these holidays, including Mother's Day, were originally about, and why they all sprung up in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. As many people have sort of remarked upon, we're living through a sort of second Gilded Age right now. Rampant inequality, rising inequality. The sort of industrialization of the 19th and early 20th centuries is sort of mirrored by the gigification and the casualization of the labor force that you and I talked about on the last episode, Megan. And yet, we haven't seen the same kind of mass push and even sort of, like, I would argue, opportunities for things to be co-opted that happened a century ago.
That's very true. And I think it is an opportunity being missed for coalition building on the left. I don't know to what extent the kind of anti-child leftism is representative of the left generally. But maybe it's kind of more of a degrowth idea that, we don't need to be having children. We shouldn't be having children. Nobody can afford children. And then that kind of turns to an anti-child issue. Or if it's a matter of, the empty valorization of motherhood being extremely fascist coded.
That's true.
You know, because, and again, you never want to copy policy proposals from Hitler. And the kind of American pronatalist movement is now suggesting motherhood medals, which is definitely something that they did in the Third Reich, and it's not great. Because it's not about solving anybody's problem. It's just about saying, great job, ladies. And that's not, it doesn't incentivize anybody to have children who doesn't want them. It doesn't make it easier for people who do want children to have children. And so it's just a very weird kind of messy political time in conversations about motherhood specifically, because saying I want people who don't want to have kids to be able to not have kids, and I want people who want to have kids to be able to have kids, is kind of a long and complicated message, I think.
And I also think there's a degree here, and I don't know, I'm sort of just speaking off the top of my head on this, that like, there's an unwillingness to defend on the left in the way that there didn't used to be, right? The way that these progressive movements were led by women in the early 20th century. There's an unwillingness to defend even the like sort of very nature of motherhood, because it is so like right-wing coded. There's this idea that like, you know, if you are going to be if you're going to make those arguments, talk about like motherhood, then you are implicitly attaching a woman's value to the fact that she is a mother, right? Which is something that we don't necessarily want to do. And like you said, it's hard to sort of disentangle those messages when it's gotten so messy between the sort of right-coded, like pro-natalist people and the more left-coded, like women's rights movement, which should include like a mother's rights element to it. But quite frankly, it just doesn't seem to right now.
Karen, did it used to be this complicated?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, it's always been a bit like this. Yeah. Well, when I remember when I was young, this was when I was a kid, when like it's kind of, my parents were a little bit too old to be hippies, and I was a little bit too young to be a hippie. So, but like there was sort of like this Earth Mother thing in the 70s that would like, you wore granny glasses and a poncho and put wheat germ on everything. And that was sort of mixed in with some of the politics of that era, the late 60s, early 70s. But it was also, I think, sort of almost like a way to kind of channel the women to the softer side of the movement, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we always talk about, how sexism shows up in even left-wing movements, that a movement might be about liberation, but somehow it's always the women making the coffee no matter what, and that actually activated a lot of women's liberation folks from the anti-war movement who saw how they were being treated in other leftist spaces. Mm-hmm. And so it seems kind of perpetual that women are put into caring roles, and then society is not interested in giving tools that we could use to better care.
I mean, an example of this is like, somebody's got to watch the kids, right? So when I was like 10, my mother was the secretary of the local chapter of the League of Women Voters, right? And part of her job as secretary was to produce the monthly newsletter, which in the 70s was a whole thing. You had to do it like on mimeograph stencils on a typewriter, and it, involved a lot of work. And so I got to watch my brother and sister while she was doing this. And she always wanted me to take them outside so they would be completely out of her hair, but it was hot. It was the summertime. I didn't want to be out there. So, I mean, the thing is, somebody's got to watch the kids while the women who are in the movement, whether that be the, genuine radical left or the local League of Women Voters, somebody's got to watch the kids. And sometimes that's the older sibling, and sometimes it just doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, we have two eldest daughters here. I don't know if you guys could pick up on the energy.
Yes, eldest daughter, and then in my kind of like extended family, for me, my mom's friends, the chosen family, I'm the eldest and the only girl, and that always gets, like, well, I guess I'm the one helping with the dishes. Okay, even for a bunch of like fairly lefty, senior members of that group, they're like, oh yeah, Megan's gonna help. So yeah, it is what just happens. It's what happens. And and to a certain extent, like I'm all of this is off the top of my head. It requires so much fighting to disentangle ourselves from those gender roles. So it seems like a more reasonable ask to just say, okay, so we can still do all of those things that you expect of women. We can provide that care work, but we're not even willing to make it easier to provide the care work in some senses. And that, like, asking for a heartfelt letter rather than a Hallmark card does not seem unreasonable, and yet we have watered it down even further.
Yeah, to the point where like you have like in cards they'll, just like the pre-printed messages and everything, and people will just sort of sign their name and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think another element here that maybe we can just hit before we take a break and talk about some of the like sort of solutions we can point to here is, at the same time that you have this overt increasing commercialization of Mother's Day, this co-optation of what was a more left-wing movement into this right-wing sort of coded thing. In the mid to late 20th century, you also have women who are leading movements that are perceived as like anti-women's liberation. Like Phyllis Schlafly was the opponent of the Equal Rights Amendment, right? And again, I don't know that these things are separable, right? That like the idea that you're commercializing Mother's Day, you're putting this like messaging forward, right? That a woman's place is in the home with the kids, even in these sort of more putatively left-wing spaces. You're in the sort of care element of those spaces, right? I don't think it's like incredibly surprising that you would see some women be a part of these and at the head of these movements that are, at least nowadays, we might call like anti-women's rights, especially since it was against the Equal Rights Amendment, right? And so I don't know how we solve that problem, but I suppose we are going to talk about it when we come back. But before we do that, any additional sort of thoughts here, just bringing it back to the origins of Mother's Day and what those mean for the both of you?
Not to get us down a complete crazy rabbit hole about trad wives, but I will graze the surface. There's something very lonely about the projection of trad wife content. Maybe you see crossovers sometimes with other trad wives, but it's usually isolated. It's a woman and her family, and maybe her husband shows up. And that seems very antithetical to Ann Jarvis's message about women supporting each other and sharing skills and developing knowledge around the best ways to perform all of these tasks for their families. We talk so much on this podcast about community and community development, and passively taking in content is the opposite of that. And the people who are producing content telling you how you should be a mother are often giving you the opposite of her message. And it seems very bootstrappy, very American, quote unquote, not necessarily in a good way, to say you are responsible for your own family and taking care of them perfectly. And here are my 10 tips. And if you send me $5, I'll give you 10 more. But the key, it seems, to mothers being successful in Ann Jarvis's interpretation was to come together in community. And that's one of the reasons why it seems like, I think, we've kind of situated the church in the celebration of mothers and the support of mothers, is because it provides a space to do that and an additional forum to do that, as well as just creating individual networks outside of our church communities.
Yeah, I also think that the move toward intensive parenting it just puts so much more pressure. I mean, I feel like parenting, even since you were a kid, has gotten more intensive, and certainly since I was a kid. I mean, I'm in that, go outside, come back when the street lights come on kind of, and that, the bar at what what you have to do, the intense, that you have. I mean, and even with like the whole tradition trad wife thing. I mean, like my great grandmother, I'm sure, was a traditional wife by those standards, and yet I can't imagine that on the farm in Ohio she was watching her kids all the time, right? She had to, if you think of the labor intensiveness of being a farm wife in the early, around this same time, right? The early 1900s. I mean, you weren't creating wonderful educational enrichment opportunities for your four children. She had four. Um, you were, because you had to actually, you had to actually be gardening and washing the clothes by hands and washing the dishes by hand and, you know, sewing and making I mean, there was just no way that you could parent the way mothers are expected to parent now, you know, and
Absolutely. Intensive parenting has filled the time that has been saved by the invention of the dishwasher and the clothes washing devices and a refrigerator so you don't have to go to the store every day. We've filled that time, and actually it takes more time. Parents spend more time doing things
Mhm.
because we have changed as you say, completely changed our standards about what is required of parents and especially mothers.
Right.
And I think this goes all the way back to like one of our very first episodes that we did, the helicopter parenting
Yeah.
episode, where it's like there's at the same time that there's this like valorization in the contemporary version of Mother's Day of, the traditional values of motherhood and all of that. We also have this societal expectation that if you do not spend enough time actively and intensively parenting your children, and trying to remove obstacles in their path, then you are a bad mother. And mothers get that way more than fathers do, right? Like the expectation that a father be around intensively parenting his children all the time is nowhere near as strong as the expectation is for mothers. And so I think that, at the same time that we're not actually making things easier for mothers' lives, we're making it harder. We're expecting women and mothers to just be satisfied with a day at a Hallmark card. And I don't think that anyone can really argue that that's proper, quite frankly.
Yep. But we have
Why don't we
ideas on how to make it better.
Yeah, why don't we take a little bit of a break? We will come back and we will talk about both, personal and some policy ways that we can make things better and embrace sort of the roots of Mother's Day rather than what it has become in today's day and age.
Welcome back to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition. When we left you, we were discussing how Mother's Day had really moved from its origins as a opportunity to make mothers' lives easier, and had just kind of slid on to making people feel better about themselves, not about moms. I think that's a reasonable way to describe it, because I'm not sure that any of us really feel good about a preset Hallmark card as the total celebration for mothers and what they do to make society work. I don't know.
Things should be more than just a greeting card and breakfast out at a nice restaurant,
Especially when there are so many things that we can actually do to make the lives of parents generally, and mothers in particular, a lot easier.
Yeah. So Megan, what are some of those things that we can do at both sort of a policy level first, especially since, as we talked about the origins of Mother's Day being about things that are policy oriented.
Policy. Yeah, absolutely.
What can we do? What can we do?
Well, many of the things that Ann Jarvis really started her kind of social work on were things that are now performed by state government, local government, etc., or were things that were very directly connected to national policy, things like war. She was pacifist, abolitionist, and so some things that we can do at the policy level to make things easier for women and for mothers. I would say the first thing I really want to talk about is improved healthcare access, because we've seen that the state has really taken over, hygiene generally. Food safety inspection at the moment is still a thing that the government does.
Yeah, for the
And
moment, being the big operative
important
words
caveat.
there.
But improved healthcare access and public health. Because who stays home with a sick child? Generally speaking, it is going to be the mother. Who benefits from having to stay home with sick children less? Probably mom as well. That would be something that could improve mothers' lives, specifically to the extent that they are the ones who have to perform that labor. Public health measures like improving ventilation in schools, which is something that we started talking about a lot early COVID, is something that actually could help improve the public health generally, less circulation of airborne disease, but then could be beneficial to mothers in the sense that they have to spend less time doing that additional labor of taking care of sick children or sick relatives, family members, not necessarily children. Improved ventilation in all public spaces could be beneficial in that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, to this point, I mean, I wasn't paying attention to this, but how many years, Mom, would you say that I was able to make it through a school year without like getting everyone in the family sick by bringing home the flu during flu season, right? Like, probably only a couple.
Well, yeah. Well, I just remember being like really good, especially when you were younger. Your preschool day was 4 hours, the preschool you went to. And I figured out that if I gave you a Tylenol 15 minutes before I dropped you off, the fever you would be okay for those 4 hours. So I could get my work
and they'd let him stay in school.
if you were like really, really sick. But just if it was like a cold and I was like, you could probably
you could kind of manage. Well, I mean, it's the same, there was that like early COVID time where it's like, if you even had the vaguest sniffle, you stayed home. And for a minute, I thought, oh man, we're going to completely change the paradigm about how people use their sick leave, and it's going to vastly decrease disease transmission. This is going to be amazing. And I didn't particularly think of myself as being afraid of, getting sick generally, but that's not what wound up happening. It's everybody still muscles through no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
But were you sending him to school just so you didn't have to take time off or could get work done without having to? Okay, yeah, makes perfect sense. And I am sure you are not in any way the only mom who's ever done that. But that really takes me to this other point I want to make about the motherhood penalty in employment, because the motherhood penalty, decreased wages for people who are moms, not dads, moms, is a real thing and pretty much accounts for the gender wage gap. And so there's a study from Heinrich Kleven, who's at Princeton. He used data from Denmark, which has a robust welfare state. So it's not just, the lack of welfare state in the US that is doing this to us. Women's income drops and never recovers when women take time off for maternity leave, basically. And it never recovers for a couple of reasons. I'm kind of speculating and extrapolating from his data now a little bit, because you've got that trajectory that, kind of starts to go up and matches women who are not parents, but it doesn't quite match. And I think part of that is the additional caregiving responsibilities that you see women having, because they are the ones who are going to be staying home if they have a sick child. And so that continues to kind of hold them back. Even if you're not firing a person for using a sick day to care for a child, they're not getting the opportunities that they might otherwise be able to get. They're not getting those kind of stretch assignments. They're not having that opportunity to put themselves out there as somebody for promotion. If they're a person who in the back of management's mind, they're like, well, they're fine, but sometimes they're here and sometimes they're not. That's not something that really helps women to be thinking that way.
And I think this is like there's a social degree to which, like, this is, as we said, only true for mothers, but it's only true for mothers, I think, because of that social expectation. Like, if I'm remembering the literature on this correctly, there's actually a wage premium for fathers. Like, their wages go up right after having a child. And like, this is sort of independent of, like picking up more shifts at work to provide more for the family or whatever. It's the like two guys in the corner office being like, oh, well, Clayton's got a child on the way, so he probably deserves a little extra in order to make sure that his family, is doing fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, the exact opposite kind of conversation happens for moms in probably the same businesses, right? Like, oh, well, Megan's about to have a kid. She's probably not going to be around as much. She's going to be taken off in the middle of the day to go pick her kid up from daycare, right? Don't know if we can trust her, as you said, with the reach assignments, with the promotion and all of that. So it's even when I think the data does not really support the idea that, mothers in the workforce are less productive than their male counterparts. And also in the same way that like other kinds of career breaks are expected and even encouraged, right? People going back to school, people getting advanced degrees, people just taking time off, right? Like those don't have these really strong, persistent wage penalties, but being a mother and taking maternity leave absolutely does.
Yep.
Which is not great.
Nope. Not feeling amazing. Yeah, and you look at economies that seem to have kind of built a setup that you would think would support this, and which is why it's so surprising to see that this data comes from Denmark, where
it's like if there were one place that wasn't going to have this kind of effect, you would imagine perhaps one of these Nordic countries.
You would. Also, he finds that they in Denmark they let couples split up the bulk amount of parental leave. But it turns out that in heterosexual couples, the father is taking 10% of the leave only. And so I think this is a 2018 study, so it may be preempted by other work, but I think it was Sweden that was making the couples split it in half. Like the woman could only take up to a certain amount of time and the man could only, had to take the rest of it or they lost it. And I wonder if that changes that calculus at all. But I think career breaks, as Clayton said, career breaks should be expected. And if we want to value parenting as a society, I think we send the wrong signal as an economy when we say that women's skills are worth less because they took time off for pregnancy, birth, and parenting an infant. This is valuable to society, but it is harmful to our business. And so we don't want you here is not the message that we should be sending women, especially in a society where most couples do need two incomes to get by, which brings me to my next policy suggestion. Universal basic income.
Okay.
I think would not be the world's worst idea. I think that creates an environment where if women want to work full-time, they can. If they don't want to work full-time, they don't have to. And that gives that kind of flexibility to kind of structure a family economic situation in their own kind of way. And then you feel less of this pressure and less of the kind of push against having children if you are not going to suffer that wage penalty, or if that wage penalty can be made up through the UBI.
And I think this speaks a little bit to what I at least recall of our experience, Mom. Like, you were working full-time as an assistant pastor, an associate pastor when I was born, right?
I just finished a job as an associate pastor. The contract ended like a few weeks before you were born, and then I didn't go back to work for about 18 months, and then when I did, it was half-time.
Yeah, because the head pastor job at Trinity was a half-time job, but then off. Yeah. And I think to the point of universal basic income, a big perk of that job was the manse, right?
Oh, for sure, they afforded us basically the job was you get to the compensation was you get to live in this house and a few extra $100 a month. Yeah,
perfect.
Yeah,
who wouldn't take that?
And to that point specifically, like, not every job out there is going to be able to offer a manse to new mothers, right? But I think the fact that, I'm just speaking for myself here, like the fact that you were able to be around a lot while Clara and I were very little was good, right? The fact that you were able to like take us on bus rides down to downtown Portland to make sure that we knew how to use public transportation and didn't grow up to be weirdos, like that was helpful. That was useful.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I think, as to Megan's point, like if there's a policy solution where you have this sort of universal basic income that allows more mothers to like make the choice that you made, essentially. Um, you know, that gives a broader group of people who don't have access to the church manse the opportunity to do sort of the same thing, right? Without necessarily sacrificing a strong level of like career progression or a huge amount of income. As Megan says, remove sort of the push and pull factor of like, well, can I afford to have children? Can I afford to take time off of work? So on and so
Right.
forth.
Well, sure. But I mean, the other thing that you talk about a lot is housing policy and, having access to affordable housing close to where you work. Because you remember the manse was 3 blocks from the church. I mean, the having the house itself was great, but the fact that it was that close to the church was also amazing because when I was at work, I could like if I had an evening meeting, I pushed back from the dinner table, walk 3 blocks, and there I am. It wasn't like this long commute, having to drop you off one place and then go. Also, there was a preschool right there at the church, so that also was helpful.
Really, you're selling me on going into ministry.
Well,
that seems to be the solution.
There were a lot of things that came together. But the other thing was, it took us a long while as a household to recover financially from those 6 years when I was working half time. I mean, it did. I mean, Dad will sometimes say, if it hadn't been for that particular period of time where I was working half time and he was trying to start a business that didn't work, we could have retired. We could be retiring much sooner than we anticipating being able to retire. So, yeah.
I do think to the point about housing, though, like to sort of merge it-ish with the universal basic income, like there's this idea that this is me getting up on my hobby horse. I'm sorry, everyone. There's this idea that lots.
Why I didn't put housing policy in the outline, man. I knew you'd get us there.
there's this idea. For just to be clear, I didn't get us here. I did not tell Mom to do this in any way. Anyway, but like people have this idea that like all we need to do is increase wages and then that will solve the problem of people not being able to afford housing. But it's like if you were to increase everyone's wages by $10,000, the price of housing is just gonna go up to match it, right? Like it's in a supply constrained environment, you can't subsidize your way out of that shortage, right? But a universal basic income combined with a robust housing policy that makes it easier for families to afford housing near where the parents work, that absolutely would help to achieve sort of both of those elements, those degrees of both offering the opportunity without this huge loss of income for mothers to have children, and the ability of them to continue perhaps working full time, but with an easier commute, less trouble for them to actually get to and from their place of employment. And then also, I guess importantly, right, lowered housing costs so that you're not spending as much of your income on a place to live and can spend more income on things like retirement savings or, leisure or other kinds of expenditures that aren't, do I have a roof over my head?
I think policies reducing childcare costs also seem to be an important note to this story. I don't know if it was a church preschool that you guys had, Clayton and Clara. And Clara? Yes?
It was we rented space to a.
Oh, okay.
That was
yes, it was a very hippy-dippy co-op type of
it had
school.
The word collective in its name. The Southwest Parent-Child Collective. Yes.
And I remember,
that sounds very Portland.
Well, it was, the parents were expected to, help out in the classroom one day a week. It was quite the thing. It was good. It was good.
I enjoyed it. I remember enjoying it. I remember they had like pancake days.
Yeah.
It was fun.
That's what you got to sell your preschool on. My mother did something that I didn't realize for many, many years, was something that she was doing out of her own pocket. I thought that she had the world's greatest boss. In their office building where I was in preschool, but my brother was an infant. My mom had rented an office. Like it wasn't even like an office suite. It was just an office next to the company that she was working for. And she set up her own daycare essentially, where she just had toys for my brother to play with and a workspace for herself. And when she would put him down for a nap, then she could go back into the main office with a baby monitor and work in the main office for her boss. And I thought her boss was just like, that's the most progressive thing I've ever heard of. It's just like, no, I was paying for all of that. But it was in a time when like remote working was not really a thing. And that was downtown, and we lived way out in the southeast suburbs. It was a way for her to keep working and keep making that money. And obviously she was making enough to be able to afford this. Although I think it's Lean In, where Sheryl Sandberg says, even if it isn't gonna be a break-even situation, even if it costs you more to pay for childcare to go back to work earlier, you should, to avoid the motherhood penalty. And that's just so bleak. Like, is that really what we want to tell people is the value of parenting? You know, you should be willing to take an economic hit to avoid a bigger one down the road for the crime of having kids, like, which we keep telling people we need. So I don't know. I'm gonna get all exercised here. Any more policy solution?
Well, I think to the point about childcare, like, you know, it's a really difficult problem. Like, because the thing about like really early childhood childcare and childhood education is that like you need a really like low ratio of kids to like people to look after them. Really low ratio of kids to educators, things like that.
And that's what makes it so
expensive.
What makes it
so expensive, right? But the challenge with that is that like, you know, the like wages are high in the United States, right, relative to other parts of the world. And so you have people who could be doing childcare, or they could be doing something else that is more remunerative, right? Like that pays them higher. And so you have to like at least match a little bit of that wage premium.
What else they could be doing? That sounds like a market failure, my friend. Like, what do we do to fix a market failure?
And so I think there are
even policy things sometimes have unintended consequences. Like California has now the universal preschool in the public schools for 4-year-olds, but that makes the economic model of most daycare centers no longer work. You've got to have those 4-year-olds for whom the teacher-child ratio is much lower, and you can make money in order to keep the infant slots open, because with infants, it's one staff person to every 4 infants, which is nobody could run an affordable childcare center with just infants. The cost is so much. You have to have those older kids where it's 1 to 12.
I had never thought about that. That's really interesting, and you're right. You would never know that.
By taking the 4-year-olds out of the equation, there are lots of daycare centers that are just straight up closing because they can't make the financial model work.
It's almost like the individual mandate, but for childcare. You have to keep the 4-year-olds in the daycare centers.
Yes.
To keep them affordable.
Yes.
Huh.
Yeah. And so the tricky thing here is that like there's no way to like automate or improve efficiency in daycare, right? Like this is why the cost of like services goes up faster than the cost of products. Like this is just sort of a fundamental problem that like wealthy countries face, which is that like, you know, you can you know, create processes and machines and stuff that will make, you know, computers and phones and microphones and everything that we're all using to make this podcast way more cheaply and efficiently, right? But the guy who cuts your hair can still only do so many haircuts every single day, right? The people who watch your children can only look after so many kids, right? And so either you create really large government subsidies to help draw people into the profession, to help make the model of these daycares cost effective by providing government subsidies or by providing just like universal public daycare, that kind of thing. Or you have to substantially increase the amount of people who can do those jobs. And that is something you can only really do in a rich country through immigration, right? And so, quite frankly, it's a few steps removed, right, from the proximal problem of really expensive childcares, but also things like comprehensive immigration reform would help with this particular kind of problem. You see the sort of like, public daycare plus subsidy plus au pair model in many European countries, but it is less common here in the United States. And I think that kind of program, that kind of thing, where you have this comprehensive immigration reform, the ability for not only, like guest workers to work in agriculture and manufacturing, but also to work in things like childcare if you're not comfortable or whatever with having them stay here permanently, which you should be comfortable with in the first place, but sort of neither here nor there. This isn't an episode about immigration. But that's sort of the only other thing you can do in this situation to help solve this cost disease problem of services that aren't as scalable being more expensive relative to products and that kind of thing as countries grow wealthier and as wages rise. So that's the long story short of my spiel on how to solve the crisis of how much daycare costs.
Yeah, let's get it figured out in the next couple of years, please. TikTok. Do we want to move on to personal things?
Yeah, let's move
each
on
of us
to some...
have total control over in our own lives to make mothers and parents' lives easier.
Let's move on to some personal things, because I feel like we've gone pretty hard on the policy aspect here, but there are, yes, things that, as you mentioned, are totally within our direct control to make mothers' lives easier.
Just have one, and this might be a jumping off point for a broader discussion, but I would like to say we should not be jerks about kids being in public.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's become, like, we talked about this a little bit, kind of anti-growth, anti-child kind of city culture almost, where we kind of have an attitude about kids being in restaurants or just in public spaces generally, airplanes. I wound up seated my parents lived in Hawaii for a bit. I was seated next to families with kids, I think constantly, just because the universe knew that I wasn't going to be terrible about it.
Mm-hmm.
But you want to be helpful to those parents, because in many cases, they would want their kids to be perfect angels as much as anyone, probably more so. And their kids may not be super stoked about being stuck in a metal tube for 5 hours. And so, I would try to be helpful to those parents who were struggling, and their response was almost always surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing, I don't know how many times I said children are a public good to these parents. If a parent is trying to teach their child how to behave in public, being supportive of that parent is good. You just mentioned Karen taking Clayton on the bus to make sure that Clayton, maybe you were the one who said it, that you guys would take the bus and to make sure he knew how to use the bus. I ran into a parent with their child at the bank the other day, and the parent's like, okay, here's how we do this. That's what you need to be doing with kids. And if you as a parent are so intimidated out of doing that because you think you're going to run into somebody who's being terrible to you, then you have children who can't do things who turn into adults who can't do things. And that's not the direction we want our society to go. If a parent isn't doing what you think they need to be doing, model the behavior you want the child to emulate, but otherwise be helpful or be quiet. And those are really your options, I think, when it comes to other people parenting in public. We should be as supportive as we can. There's my rant off the soapbox.
I think this bridges into something we've talked about several times, which is this idea that lots of people seem to have internalized, that they don't have any like positive pro-social obligations to other people. When one of those things is, hey, you were a kid once and your parents needed to take you out in public, right? Like, you need to pay that forward a little bit, right? Like, and be courteous and helpful to people who have children in public, right? Like, one of these days, right? Like, you are going to be, a 70-year-old person, and you're going to need nurses and doctors who are younger than you, to do things. Like, you're going to need people who are working in order to make sure that you have social security. You are going to need people to do jobs. And the only way that people are going to be there to do those jobs is if people have kids. And if people feel, even on the margins, that having children is going to mean they totally cannot go out in public because people are going to be terrible to them, then that is not a long-term recipe for success. It is not a long-term recipe for those people who you are going to need 30, 40 years from now to exist. Right? It just isn't. It's not going to work. And frankly, like, you know, I'm much more plugged in, obviously, to the like social media scene of the United States than I am to other countries. But having lived abroad for a little while, this does seem to be like quite an America-centric attitude towards children. Like, yes, there are fertility problems everywhere, right? But I only really see from the United States this attitude that like children don't belong in public, and like I should be allowed to experience child-free spaces, right? Like I should be able to like purchase tickets on a child-free airplane, right? Like that's something that only seems to exist here, and I think it is like super insidious and really harmful.
And I bet there's like a business model for that, just like there's a business model for airlines that make it really easy to fly with your dog. If you really want a guaranteed child-free flight, I bet you could start that business. But it's just bizarre, and I struggle to wrap my head around it because it's not some, and I can understand, you know, maybe I don't want to be around kids because I'm struggling with infertility or something like that. Maybe you are having a hard time personally with being around children for a reason, but the general disposition, I can't imagine everyone I've heard espouse that opinion is struggling with infertility. Let me put it that way. And it really, yeah, it just seems very myopic, and it seems like there are just negative consequences in terms of making our society just meaner. It's not just about the kids, but it just, yeah, that's, I have no good way to wrap up this thought other than I don't like it and we should stop.
Well, I think there's a degree here, like, again, this goes into something that we've talked about in the past of like, you know, it takes a village, as it were, right? And so like, Megan, you know this, Mom, you don't know. One of our friends in the cohort, his wife recently just had a child, right? Like a month or so ago.
It was spring break.
Yes, spring break.
They timed it really well.
Yes. And so like, but the thing is, right? Like, you know, he didn't ask us for help, but a bunch of us immediately offered, like, you know, are there things that we can do over the course of the next few months to make this easier for you and your wife? And initially they were like, well, we just need to figure things out. We need to like make sure that like we can do this, right? Her parents are coming, my parents are coming, right? But even
You've also got a really strong community here in LA that is not the grad department. Yeah,
but even just like the offer, right? Like I remember, you know, I don't know exactly how much of this was actually me being watched and how much of it's me remembering it, but I remember our neighbors. I was always in their yard in Portland when I was yes. And like, if we had been next to a family that was like really curmudgeonly about that, you know, like get your kids off of my lawn, right? Like that would have not been nearly as fulfilling a childhood for me.
There's a pack of like early elementary school children across the street from me. I have no idea which one lives in which house. They're just always running around.
Well, I mean, the other thing I think we hit it a little bit of like, you know, the high bar of what's good parenting. I mean, I even remember when I was expecting you, somebody asked me, so what's your theme for your nursery? And I was like, my theme is like, is it like Winnie the Pooh? Is it, you know, is it fish? Is it, I was like, the
things that won't kill him
for free, you know, that is whatever people give me for free. That was what is going to be in my nursery. Partly just, you know, where we were financially at the time, but partly it's like theme for a nursery. I mean, you know,
you're not going to remember.
I don't think that was a thing like 50 years ago or 80 years ago. I mean, if you even had a nursery, you know.
Yeah, definitely not 50 or 80 years ago.
you just had, you had a crib. You hear about, not in my family, but people whose like crib was actually a dresser drawer, right? Because they couldn't afford a crib. So I just think like the pressure to have like that in order to have a baby, you have to have a nursery with a decorating theme. It's just like, that's like, if you enjoy that, fine. I'm not, if that's something that really gives you joy is like decorating the nursery, that's fine. But if like, once you get to the point where everybody is expected to have that, and if what you really have is a second bedroom that is also the office, to which you're going to put the crib and anything that anybody gives you for free, like a dresser or a changing table, the mobile that they had for their own kid, that's okay. You don't have to feel like the themed nursery is goals for everybody.
That's a phenomenal point. And I would have thought that was Instagram has made us think that, but this is obviously quite pre-Instagram. and And we also like the sense of kind of ownership of, well, you need a crib, and then Susie down the street needs a crib. And so like it didn't, my impression, and it's an impression I actually get from like the Ramona Quimby books of all things, is like a block has one crib and it just kind of rotates from whoever has an infant to the next house,
Definite different opinions on that. Because like I said, we got a lot of hand-me-downs for our kids, both from neighbors and from family, because you have lots of aunts and uncles and older cousins. But I remember I was trying to I had a whole bunch of Clara's clothes, and there was a family in our church who had a daughter about 2 years younger than she. And I thought, oh, they'll love all these little girl clothes. And when I offered them to the mom, she was kind of like, you're offering me your old clothes? Ew. It's kind of like, whenever anybody gave me clothes for my kids, I was like, hey, I don't have to pay for clothes now. I don't know.
So I think what all of this sort of boils down to is like the idea that it really does take a village, right? And we used to have larger and more frequent villages than perhaps we do right now. And, sure, there's lots of policy stuff that we can do, but not everything needs to be done by the state. And some of the clearest, most impactful things that we can do is when people in our lives, people in our orbit, friends and family have children, you can offer to help out, right? This sort of like generalized norm of reciprocity that like we recognize that you help out when like their child needs, somewhere to stay for an afternoon as they go to their job or something. And then, sometime down the line, they'll help you out when your child needs this, or, just like they'll help you out when, you need help painting the front steps of your house or something like that, right? Like this generalized norm of reciprocity needs to come back in a way that I think it seems to have existed in the early days of the Let's Have Mother's Day campaign. This idea that like, let's do things for each other. Let's try to stop the country from going to war so all of our sons die. Let's try to come together as a community to make mothers' lives easier. That needs to come back in the way that, as we sometimes talk about on this show, actually means returning to a previous era of how things were done in the past, rather than sort of a newfangled way that we have interpreted how things were done in the past.
Right. Actually, I could end up with like the last paragraph of the Mother's Day Declaration.
Sure, let's do it.
Right. In the name of womanhood and humanity, I earnestly ask that a general Congress of women, without limit of nationality, may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient, and at the earliest period, consistent with its objects, to promote the alliance of different nationalities, to promote the amicable settlement of international questions, and to promote the great and general interests of peace.
Sounds pretty woke to me. Sounds pretty woke. All right, well, with that in mind, we will see you guys next time. I have been Clayton Becker.
I have been Megan Cox.
I've been Karen Safia.
We'll see you guys on the next one.
All right.